Welcome back, incredible thinkers. I'm Sue Sabella, your Great Minds teacher. Let's see what we need for today. Today, we'll need Martin Luther King Jr. and the March on Washington, handout 4A, Connecting Historical Events, handout 4B, the Evidence Organizer, your journal, and a pencil. Please pause here to gather what you need and just hit play when you're ready to continue. In kindergarten and first grade, you learned that images are just as important as text or words on a page. Images provide lots of information. Historical photographs, specifically, give us information about historical events. And by studying those photographs or images, we can learn a great deal about history. In addition to looking at historical images closely, it's also important to look at the connections between historical events. Let's read this question together. What does looking at historical connections reveal to us? Today, we're going to take an even closer look at historical connections. And by looking at those connections closely, it can tell us a lot about historical events. I'd like you to consider or think about the two texts that we've been introduced to so far, Martin Luther King Jr. and the March on Washington, and also Ruby Bridges Goes to School, My True Story. I want you to think about this question. Did these books happen now, in the present, or in the past? Pause here to tell your learning partner and just hit play when you're ready to continue. Both of these events that were depicted in these stories happened in the past. And one of the ways that we can tell is through the use of the images, the historical images. History is the study of past events. What have you learned about American history so far this year? Pause to tell a learning partner or to do some powerful thinking, and just hit play when you're ready to continue. So far this year, we've learned about the American West. We learned about the Native Americans and how they were the earliest people. We also learned about the settlers and the impact that they had on the land and the animals as they moved west. We also learned about Teddy Roosevelt and how he worked with people to save the buffalo and to restore the population of the buffalo in the West. Historical events happened in the past and they cause important changes. To study this in depth, we're going to zoom in on page 11 in this text to read it closely. We'll also be using handout 4A, Connecting Historical Events. This handout will help us think very closely about page 11 in Martin Luther King Jr. and the March on Washington. Please pause here to grab this handout now and follow the directions to cut out the boxes below. If you do not have a copy of this handout that you can cut up, no worries. What you can do is just grab 3 pieces of scrap paper and copy each one of these sentences onto a piece of scrap paper. So pause here to get your boxes ready, either by cutting them out or making them on scrap paper, and just hit play when you're ready to continue. Now that you have your boxes cut out, I'd like you to notice the check mark in the corner. And you know what that means. Your classroom teacher will take this opportunity to check in with you. Today, it'll be about the historical connections, and we'll be using page 11 from this text to help us think more deeply about those connections. Whenever we read a text closely, especially a short or small section, we end up reading that text multiple times with different purposes in mind. As I read this page aloud, I'd like you to keep this question in mind. What did President Lincoln do over 100 years ago? Ready? Here we go. It is because 100 years ago, President Lincoln helped to free the people who were slaves. It was during the Civil War. President Lincoln knew that slavery had to end. Now it is 1963. There has been no slavery for a long time, but are Black people and white people treated equally? No. What did President Lincoln do over 100 years ago? Pause here to tell your learning partner. And also, how do you know? Point to the textual evidence on this page. Just hit play when you're ready to continue. Over 100 years ago, President Lincoln ended slavery. We know this from page 11 because we read President Lincoln helped to free the people who were slaves. Now, let's read this page closely again with this question in mind. What was happening in 1963? Ready? Here we go. It is because 100 years ago, President Lincoln helped to free the people who were slaves. It was during the Civil War. President Lincoln knew that slavery had to end. Now it is 1963. There has been no slavery for a long time. But are Black people and white people treated equally? No. What was happening in 1963? Pause here to think about that question or to chat with a learning partner, and also find the evidence in the text that supports your answer. Just hit play when you're ready to continue. The text says that there has been no slavery for a long time. The text also says that Black people and white people are still not treated equally. So it still must not be just or fair. Just like you, all of my boxes are mixed up. I haven't put them in order yet. You'll be putting your boxes in order. Be sure to spread out your boxes either on a desk, a table, or the floor so you can read each of the sentences as we think about the order of these events. I'm going to put some words up on the screen that can help you think about how each event in each box is connected. The first phrase is long ago. Which event or which box happened long ago? Was it President Lincoln helped end slavery? In 1963, Black people were still not treated fairly, or there was slavery in the country. Which event happened first long ago? Pause here to move your box to the top and just hit play when you're ready to continue. Then what happened? Read over the events in the two remaining boxes and also read over page 11 again for support. Then move your box in under the first box. Pause to work on this and just hit play when you're ready to continue. What's the last event that you'll put in order? Locate evidence in the text that supports your decision And also use this transition word along with the event to make sure it makes sense. Pause here to make sure all of your boxes are in order and read the linking words with each sentence to see if it makes sense to you in the order that it's in. Pause here to do this work and to check your work by using the linking words. Just hit play when you're ready to continue. Your classroom teacher will let you know how you will be sharing your work. You might be taping the boxes in order in your journal, or you might take a picture of how you put your boxes in order. Pause here to take a stretch break and just hit play when you're ready to continue. How does gathering information from multiple sources work? We're going to be working as a team here. Your classroom teacher will be sharing a video with you, and that will be one source. I'm going to continue working with you in Martin Luther King Jr. and the March on Washington. We'll be using both of those sources to think more deeply about these historical texts. Since we're going to be gathering evidence from more than one text, it's even more important to keep that evidence organized. Please pause here to grab handout 4B, the evidence organizer, or create this evidence organizer in your journal. Just hit play when you're ready to continue. I've highlighted where we'll be working together today. Remember, we're approaching this as a team. We'll be working from the book Martin Luther King Jr. and the March on Washington. Your classroom teacher will view and gather evidence with you from the video. We'll be gathering evidence to answer this question for our focusing question task. What were the injustices people faced before the Civil Rights Act of 1964? We're going to be reading pages 14 through 19 in the text to gather evidence. So if you have your own copy of this book, please feel free to pause to grab it now so you can follow along in your own book, or you can pause to read to gather your own evidence. Just hit play when you're ready to continue. As we read pages 14 through 19, we'll record evidence from the text that describes the injustices of Black Americans. Ready? Here we go. In the South and in some other states, there are laws to keep Black people and white people apart. Black people cannot eat in many restaurants or stay in many hotels. Pause here to point to a sentence that has an injustice. And remember, an injustice is something that is not fair. Just hit play when you're ready to continue. You might have pointed to Black people cannot eat in many restaurants. That's evidence of an injustice. Pause here to jot down your first piece of evidence that came from this text. Just hit play when you're ready to continue. In movie theaters, they must enter by separate doors and sit way up in the balcony. On public buses, they have to take seats in the back. Pause here to jot down evidence of injustice. And remember, when we're locating evidence, it's always okay to reread and reread again if you need to. Just hit play when you're ready to continue. There are signs that say, for whites only. Even water fountains say white or colored? Which of these fountains looks nicer to you? Pause here to jot down your last piece of evidence of an injustice. Just hit play when you're ready to continue. Pause here to read over the focusing question again, and also to make sure that you have 3 pieces of evidence from this source: Martin Luther King Jr. and the March on Washington. Just hit play when you're ready to wrap up our video lesson. Be sure to hang on to handout 4B, the evidence organizer. We'll see it again when we begin to work on the focusing question task. By looking closely at the connections between historical events and by reading text closely and rereading text closely, we can sometimes understand why events happened. For example, the March on Washington happened because even though slavery had ended over 100 years prior to 1963, inequalities still existed. And because inequalities still existed, people came together to change that. Share the connections that you learned between slavery, enslaved people, and inequalities that occurred before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Share your knowledge with others, and I will see you again soon, my friends.
Okay, now I'm going to switch and show you the video that she was talking about for you to record some evidence from this video on that same handout, but instead of book evidence, this is where your video evidence should be.
A man who changed America. Do you recognize this man? He was a leader. He was a hero. His name was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King was born on January 15, 1929. Here's a picture of him when he was 6 years old. He grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. It's hard to imagine that when he was a boy, there were unfair laws that kept African American people and white people apart. In some places, they couldn't even sit next to each other on the bus. Keeping people apart like this is called segregation. In some states, people were not allowed to share the same water fountain or go to school together. When Martin grew up, he married Coretta Scott. They had 4 children. He wanted his children to be treated fairly, but there were still bad laws that kept people apart. This made Dr. King very angry, but he was a peaceful man. He did not want to use violence to change the laws. What did he do? He wrote letters. He gave speeches. He marched. He stood in front of people and shared his ideas. Eventually, the bad laws were changed. Now we can all be together. Thanks, Dr. King.
Now I want you to finish filling in your evidence from that part of the video on your evidence organizer. And then take a picture of it and put it in your Google Classroom.